Thanks to everyone for paying such earnest attention. Today I want to talk to you about the use of Facebook advertising data for humanitarian action. Why did we do this? You know, we didn't come into this problem area with Venezuelan migrants thinking we were going to work with Facebook data. We had a serious problem. Since 2016, Venezuelan migrants were arriving in Colombia and in the surrounding countries, and there was no mapping whatsoever of where they were going. There were no camps outside of Brazil, so when you go to make a case to a donor in the humanitarian community, it's important to have information on where people are, or else how are you going to assist them? So there was a serious need. When you're doing humanitarian action, you need to know two things. You need to know where the assistance is, and you need to know where the people are and what their needs are. So you need to be able to map both of them, and that's what we did with the Facebook data. Who is iMMAP? iMMAP is one of many actors in the response in Colombia. We're an NGO that works on positioning information for decision makers. So the full scenario of actors in Colombia making decisions around the humanitarian assistance, it's very large. But a lot of people were really not making decisions. They were just confused. They had some basic data that more or less there were 1 million people. Up through the first half of 2018, people were saying, oh, there may be more or less 1 million people coming out of Venezuela. Well, that's not enough information to do anything about this. You have a lot of actors in Colombia, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the presidency. The government is sort of uncertain on how to pursue this whole situation. On the one hand, they say that it's an emergency, but on the other, they're scared about alarming their own population inside the country and creating xenophobia. So there's fair justification on their side as far as not wanting to alarm the people too much, but at the same time, it's necessary to have a real down-to-earth idea of where people are and what their needs are. So these are people who have left everything behind. There was, I would argue, the misperception that most Venezuelans that had left the country were just petite bourgeoisie who had left their country because they didn't like the socialist revolution. Many of the people who started coming into Colombia after March 2018 were from rural areas, and they started coming even into the country even walking. So you have a lot of needs with these people. They're leaving everything behind. You have the UN agencies in Colombia as well, who are also decision makers. Since the government is handing over much of the responsibility for responding to the crisis to the United Nations, really much of the decision-making needs to go to the UN. And the UN strategy, for the most part, was to support the government, which was undecisive about what it wanted to do. So from iMMAP's perspective, from my perspective, which I should also add is someone who is ex-OCHA, which is part of the Secretariat working on different information management problems and planning, I had a real concern about getting this mapping data. So iMMAP works in positioning this information in the humanitarian sphere, and what I'm going to show you a bit is how we were able to sell the information to some partners so that it was used in some of the decision-making processes. One of the most important tools for the humanitarian community when deciding where assistance is to be sent is the humanitarian needs overview. This is part of what's called the humanitarian programming cycle, which even though now OCHA is not in the lead outside of Venezuela on responding to the Venezuela crisis and coordinating the Venezuela crisis, still this humanitarian programming cycle is part of the information management process with what's called the Global Humanitarian Overview. So you have what in Panama you have this platform, which is the Regional Migrant and Refugee Plan, which UNHCR and IOM, who are both here today, lead And this is a planning vehicle where you have all types of mapping going on, trying to determine where to allocate assistance. One of the big elements here for having a prioritization at the municipal level is what's called people in need distribution. So the only input that was available at the beginning that we could find was the registration, which was finalized at the end of June for Venezuelans, which had many problems because Venezuelans feared registering, right, for this registry because there was no clear end game for the government. What would happen if they registered and then the government decided to deport them, right? There was no guarantee that they would have their status regularized after they had registered. So there was fear in the Venezuelan community, and justifiably so, you could argue, although afterwards they were regularized. It's sort of a trick. They didn't tell them beforehand, but afterwards they did give them that access, which also is created sort of a cycle. So now if they open the registry again, everyone's going to come in like an avalanche from Venezuela potentially, because they're all going to expect to have regularization of their immigration status. So when you work on the HNO, you have to have some sort of input which gives you an idea of the geographic distribution of where Venezuelans are. So all we had was this registration and at the beginning. And there was another tool which was not very geographically precise, which is called the Household Integrated Survey, Gran Encuesta Integrado de Hogares. So what was interesting about that tool was that it did give us a statistically representative sample in some areas of the country regarding where Venezuelans were. What is the question that's asked on that survey? Basically, where were you born? So this has a time series going back several years, and it was interesting to use as a data point, but it didn't give us that municipal level data set that we needed to plug into the humanitarian needs overview model. When we compared the Venezuelans connected on Facebook, percentage by department, you can see that there's a certain level of similarity between the two tools. And we did some statistical analysis and shared it with the government. And what we were able to show was that there was a high similarity between the Facebook data and the Gran Encuesta Integrado de Hogares. So we showed this to the Departamento Administrativo Nacional de Estadísticas, which is the National Statistics Authority, and they have a migration table, and they were interested in the result. Migración Colombia, which is the migration authority, also had their own heat map, which apparently has a problem with like endogenous variables because of the fact they use the Gran Encuesta Integrada de Hogares as well for the result. But the question was, we could detect a lot of similarity with the Facebook data, so it got the confidence of the policy decision makers regarding the data quality. What did we do then? We sort of visualized the results and did a prioritization. And unfortunately for the other countries in the region, we don't have the same sort of data sets to compare with those in Colombia at the municipal level. We just don't have them. But because of the quality of the data, we argue that for Ecuador and Peru and other countries, this could be also a tool for distributing population. What did we do with the results? We also went through and we started distributing them in two levels. One is with the press. Revista Semana is a well-known and prestigious magazine in Colombia, and they have a migration section which is being funded by USAID. So we did some analysis with them, had it published in the magazine, had some roundtables with government officials, and they liked it. And on HDX, we started sending every 2 weeks. This data is updated by Facebook, and you can download it off of HDX. Most people don't have any way of extracting the information. So What's ended up happening is that the government and other sources are using this as a data source which updates every 2 weeks. No other data source. So at the beginning there was some skepticism. Oh, why do we need this if the registration just began or just finished? But it was a 2-month exercise which just finalized in June. So there's been nothing since last June. So the only thing you have updated at the municipal level is this data. And of course all this is part of our lobbying and advocacy effort as iMMAP with the UN agencies at the end of the day to try to get that information utilized. And there you see some of the head honchos from the government. What is the future use? I already mentioned in the future we hope to be able to use this with Peru and Ecuador, which don't have their own mapping at the municipal level, and also to use it for some trend analysis. So depending on how many Venezuelan expats are in a country or in a municipality, to be able to project this over time as we have more and more data to look at. So that would allow us to do planning for 2019, for 2020, 2021, which is part of the plan within the regional migration plan. Thank you.